A room full of millionaires laughed at the rusted metal, looking down at the quiet man examining it. They saw only diseased scrap, completely unaware of the heartbreaking sacrifice sealed inside. What happens when forgotten history finally demands to be heard? Being air in the Appalachian Mountains was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of old motor oil and damp pine. Inside the dimly lit, dusty garage, 27-year-old Caleb Thorne wiped a streak of dark grease from his hands with a ragged cloth. He paused, his eyes softening as he looked toward the corner of the small shop. 5-year-old Leo sat on an overturned wooden crate, happily driving a battered toy truck over the cracked concrete floor. For Caleb, this quiet sanctuary, the gentle hum of the mountain wind, and the innocent murmurs of his orphaned nephew, was the only real peace he had known since leaving the military. The rusted farm equipment in the bay needed replacement parts, and their meager savings wouldn't cover brand new ones. They had to make a trip down to the city. By high noon, the biting mountain chill had been replaced by the stifling, oppressive heat of an Atlanta estate garden. It was a world entirely foreign to them both. Wealthy investors in tailored linen suits and women wearing heavy, offensive perfumes milled about the sprawling, manicured lawns, sipping cold drinks and casually inspecting liquidated antiques. Caleb walked with a stiff, measured gait, faded flannel shirt, and scuffed work boots, drawing sharp, assessing glares from the crowd. He kept a firm, protective grip on Leo's small hand. The boy shrank against Caleb's leg, clutching his toy truck tightly against his chest, his wide eyes overwhelmed by the loud voices and the suffocating wall of strangers. Caleb didn't care about their judgmental stares. He was here to scavenge, for near the far edge of the property, cast aside on the grass like a forgotten disease, sat the mangled, algae-covered chassis of an old European car. It was little more than twisted aluminum, flaking rust, decades of green moss. But to Caleb, the raw metal was salvageable material, something he could clean up, cut down, and perhaps build into a proper riding model for Leo. He knelt on one knee, the damp earth immediately staining his jeans, and pulled a small, black tactical flashlight from his pocket. The click of the button was sharp in the heavy air. He shined the bright beam deep into the dark, rusted wheel well, his military-trained eyes methodically searching the structural integrity of the frame. A shadow abruptly fell over him. Eleanor Vance Hale stood just inches away, her arms crossed tight against her chest. The crisp fabric of her dark suit practically radiated disdain, her posture carrying the innate, inherited arrogance of someone who had never known a day of hard labor. Several wealthy buyers paused their conversations, gathering behind her with amused, mocking smirks. Eleanor looked down her nose at Caleb, her lips curling into a cold, practiced smile. Her voice carried effortlessly over the quieted lawn, designed specifically to humiliate even the cleaning crew wouldn't bid on this car. A few soft chuckles floated through the thick summer air. Leo pressed his face into Caleb's thigh, his small shoulders trembling slightly at the sudden, sharp attention directed at them. Caleb felt a familiar, icy tightness grip his chest. It was the kind of disciplined, suppressed anger forged in combat zones, where words meant nothing and losing your temper carried a heavy price. He looked up at Eleanor, his face a completely unreadable mask. He didn't offer her a scowl, his waist, a single breath, trying to argue or defend his worth to a woman who measured human value by the fabric of a shirt. Instead, he simply clicked his flashlight off, stood up with deliberate, unhurried slowness, pulled his worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He counted out the thin stack of bills he had saved for tractor parts and handed them directly to the estate clerk standing nervously nearby. "I'll take it," Caleb said, his voice a flat, unyielding stone. Eleanor's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She was visibly insulted by his absolute lack of intimidation, by his calm refusal to lower his eyes or apologize for his presence. He let out a short, dismissive scoff and turned away, leading her entourage back toward the glittering pavilions, leaving the poor dreamer to his pile of scrap. By early afternoon, crowds had retreated into the air-conditioned grand hall, leaving the estate driveway completely quiet. Caleb stood at the back of his old pickup truck, securing the heavy ratchet straps over the mossy twisted frame. He tightened the final strap. His thick fingers slid beneath a heavy layer of hardened mud along the main crossbar. He abruptly stopped. Beneath the decades of soft grime, and his calloused thumb brushed against a deliberately machined, razor-sharp edge of metal hidden inside the joint. An impossibly precise cut that had absolutely no reason to exist on a standard chassis. The sharp memory of that machined edge lingered in his fingers long after the winding drive back up the mountain. Now, in the dead of night, the Appalachian air outside his garage was thick and silent, broken only by the occasional, distant chirp of crickets. Inside, beneath the harsh yellow glare of a single overhead bulb, the mangled chassis sat securely on a pair of heavy steel sawhorses. Caleb stood over it, then. A bottle of industrial acid solvent in one hand and a heavy wire brush in the other. He went straight for the main crossbar where he had felt the anomaly. Working with the methodical patience of a man accustomed to dismantling dangerous things, he applied the solvent. The chemical hissed softly, eating away at the thick exterior of hardened mud, moss, and false decay. The sludge away with a clean rag. The metal beneath was pitted and rough, but something about the corrosion pattern instantly bothered his trained eye. He picked up a heavy steel wrench and tapped the center of the bar. Clang, solid. He moved his hand down a few inches, right over the spot where the rust seemed unusually thick, and tapped again. Thud. The sound was dull, deadened. It was hollow. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed over him, opening his focus. In the military, a hollow sound where there should be solid steel meant only one thing: concealment. Someone had deliberately hollowed out the structural support, sealed it by the exterior with an acidic compound to accelerate the rusting process. It was a masterful camouflage designed to make a seamless weld completely invisible to a casual observer. This wasn't a piece of junk left to rot. It was a vault. Whatever was inside had been hidden by someone desperate, someone who knew that a single misstep during recovery would destroy the contents. The disguise of time was a formidable barrier. Caleb swapped his wrench for a precision cutting wheel and pulled a protective mask over his face. He couldn't just slice blindly through the steel, then. If there were fragile materials or pressurized components inside, the intense heat and friction would incinerate them in a second. He had to bleed the heat away while cutting, millimeter by agonizing millimeter. Sweat struck his eyes beneath the mask. The acrid smell of burning metal and old oil filled the cramped, shadowy garage, but Caleb's hands remained perfectly steady. His breathing slowed, settling into the familiar, disciplined rhythm forged in life-or-death situations. He etched a shallow rectangular groove around the hidden seam, carefully controlling the depth of the blade. With a sharp, yielding crack, the old weld finally gave way. Caleb set the tool aside and pulled off his heavy leather gloves. Using a pair of needle-nose pliers, he gently pried the weakened section of the crossbar upward. Nestled inside the dark, hollow cavity, as tightly in a brittle layer of oil-soaked cloth, lay a thick, heat-resistant copper tube. He held his breath as he lifted it free. The tube was remarkably heavy for its size. He twisted the threaded brass cap at the end. It resisted for a moment before yielding with a dry, metallic screech. Inside, perfectly preserved from the dampness of the decades by the airtight seal, were 3 tight rolls of microfilm and a folded sheaf of paper. Caleb carefully extracted the paper, setting the delicate film safely on his workbench. The page was crisp, yellowed at the edges, and covered in hurried, elegant handwriting. He smoothed it out under the yellow light, his eyes scanning the ink. The words were written in English, dated late in the year 1943. It was not a mechanic's technical log. It was a farewell. The writer, a Jewish engineer, detailed a frantic, final attempt to smuggle experimental aviation blueprints out of occupied Europe. The letter spoke of brilliant colleagues who had already disappeared in the night, of a looming arrest, as a desperate prayer that this technology would somehow find its way to someone who could use it to stop the encroaching darkness. The man had sacrificed his life's work, and likely his life itself, burying his genius inside a scrap frame, just to ensure it survived the war. "They are coming for me tomorrow," the final trembling line read. "I leave this to the future. May it outlive the men who wish to burn us." The emotional weight of the words hit Caleb like a physical blow. The quiet garage around him seemed to vanish, replaced by the profound, suffocating gravity of history. Hours earlier, a woman, in an expensive suit, had looked at this metal and seen only a disease-ridden eyesore. But Caleb stared at the rusted frame now and saw a survivor. It was a dying man's final act of defiance against absolute evil. For a man who had seen the terrible, silent cost of war firsthand, the connection was immediate and deeply sacred. Under the yellow light of the garage, Caleb gripped the time-stained letter, slowly picking up his phone to call the World War II Historical Archives hotline. History Speaks. The dawn that followed the call was crisp and silent, casting long, sharp beams of pale light across the grease-stained floorboards of the mountain shop. Caleb sat on a low stool near the chassis, his arms resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the sealed copper cylinder resting on the clean workbench. He had not slept. The absolute stillness of the Appalachian morning felt heavy, charged with the quiet anxiety of a man waiting for a verdict that could either validate a dying engineer's sacrifice or crush it under the weight of modern skepticism. Beside him, the small shop was completely at peace, the innocence of his sleeping nephew upstairs, offering the only anchor to reality, while the ghost of a tragic past waited on the sawhorses. By 7 in the morning, an old, unpretentious sedan pulled up the gravel driveway, its engine cutting out with a soft rumble. The man who stepped out did not look like the wealthy elite of Atlanta. Dr. Eris Klein was 68, his hair silvered and thin, carrying a worn leather satchel with the quiet dignity of a lifetime spent cataloging the fragments of a broken century. When he walked through the open bay door, his professional caution was palpable. He gave Caleb a brief, polite nod, but his eyes instantly locked onto the rusted aluminum frame resting on the sawhorses. There was no greeting, no small talk. The gravity of what lay in the room demanded immediate, undivided attention. For more than 2 hours, the shop was enveloped in a tense, methodical rhythm. Dr. Klein did not speak a word. He utilized a heavy magnifying loupe and a specialized lens to examine the precise, acid-washed welds Caleb had uncovered. He held the yellowed papers with gloved hands, his fingers trembling slightly as he aligned the markings on the microfilm against historical schematics from his satchel. Caleb stood several paces back, his arms crossed, completely still. He resisted the urge to explain or prompt the older scholar, understanding that true expertise required space, not persuasion. The only sound was the rustle of paper and the heavy, deliberate breathing of a historian uncovering a miracle. The turning point came when Dr. Klein examined the final paragraph of the handwritten letter. The old man froze, his shoulders dropping, as if a massive, invisible weight had suddenly settled upon them. A profound silence filled the room, a stillness far deeper than the mountain air. Slowly, a single tear escaped his eye, tracing a path down his lined cheek, followed by another. He did not look at Caleb immediately. Instead, he rested his palm flat against the cold, scarred metal of the chassis, his chest heaving with a mixture of overwhelming grief and reverence. The skepticism that had guarded his professional mind for decades had completely vanished, replaced by an undeniable, earth-shattering truth that "It is authentic," the professor murmured, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the discovery. "The handwriting belongs to him. The blueprints, they are the missing link we thought were lost to the ashes of the war. Piece of our people's soul survived in your garage." By late afternoon, the serene stillness of the mountains was replaced by the clinical, air-conditioned coldness of a high-rise office in Atlanta. Billionaire sat behind her polished mahogany desk, her fingers tapping impatiently against a porcelain coffee cup. The terminal in front of her was flashing with automated notifications from international art registries and federal historical authorities. The story had broken online, rippling through the elite collecting circles like a sudden, violent tremor. The very foundations of her luxury auction house were shaking, and the elite clients who defined her status were already demanding answers about the masterpiece she had carelessly thrown into the dirt. The door opened, and her junior associate quietly slid a heavy, official document onto the desk. At the top sat the embossed seal of the International Preservation Council, and right below it was the formal certificate of authentication signed by Dr. Klein. The text was unambiguous, stripping away every ounce of her denial. The item she had discarded as worthless trash in her garden, the object she had used to publicly mock a poor man, was an irreplaceable milestone of wartime history, valued beyond anything her firm had handled in a decade. The absolute authority Eleanor had wielded so effortlessly, just days ago, evaporated into a bitter, suffocating humiliation. Pristine reputation for spotting hidden value was utterly shattered by her own blind arrogance. Eleanor bit her lip so hard she could taste the iron, her hand shaking violently as she gripped the edges of the crisp paper, realizing with sickening certainty that she would now have to roll out the red carpet to invite the impoverished mountain mechanic back to her estate. The engraved, formal invitation to return to the estate had been delivered with all the forced courtesy a humiliated institution could muster. Now, stepping into the grand auction hall of the Atlanta property, Caleb Thorne felt the immediate, suffocating weight of a room poisoned by absolute greed. The space was bathed in the blinding glare of crystal chandeliers, packed wall-to-wall with international investors, museum curators, and wealthy collectors. The air was thick with expensive cologne and the frantic, buzzing energy of people desperate to possess a newly resurrected piece of world history. Standing far in the back, deliberately distanced from the velvet ropes and the flashing cameras, Caleb remained a quiet island in a sea of chaos. He wore the exact same faded, flannel shirt and scuffed boots he had worn weeks prior. Beachels. Cradled securely in his strong arms was 5-year-old Leo, who had buried his face Caleb's neck to hide from the overwhelming noise. His small fingers clutching his battered toy truck like a lifeline, Caleb gently rubbed the boy's back, his eyes completely indifferent to the spectacle unfolding before him. At the front of the room, standing behind a polished mahogany podium, Eleanor Vance Hale looked as though she were holding on to the wood for dear life. Her usual imperious, untouchable aura had fractured. Tonight, she was forced to act as the master of ceremonies for the very object she had publicly condemned as diseased scrap. Every word she spoke about the Jewish engineer's brilliant, tragic sacrifice, then a sound, and the miraculous preservation of the European prototype, was a bitter admission of her own profound ignorance. She opened the bidding at $3 million. The room erupted. Paddles shot up from the front rows, phone banks on the side walls, lit up with anonymous international bids. 5 million, 8 million, 10 million. The numbers climbed with a dizzying, sickening speed, transforming a sacred historical artifact into a frantic display of financial dominance. Through the rising chaos, Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the back of the hall, seeking the man who had orchestrated her professional nightmare. She expected to see him gloating, or at least stunned by the sudden life-altering wealth accumulating in his name. Instead, she saw a man who wasn't even looking at the bidding screen. Caleb was simply adjusting Leo's jacket, whispering softly to the child to keep him calm. His complete detachment from the money, from the very thing that defined her entire universe, was the final, devastating blow. Eleanor realized, with a quiet and agonizing certainty, he had been entirely defeated by a man who placed absolutely no value on her world. Sold, Eleanor finally announced, her voice tight and hollow as she struck the gavel. For $12,500,000, the hall exploded into applause. But Caleb had already turned his back to the room. When the media and a swarm of financial advisors tried to crowd him in the lobby, offering glasses of champagne and aggressive investment portfolios, Caleb moved right past them without breaking his stride. He did not grant interviews. He did not smile for the cameras. He simply walked into the estate's private administrative office and locked the door behind him. Sitting at a quiet table with a breathless estate lawyer, Caleb pulled a pen from his pocket. He didn't ask for the funds to be wired to a personal checking account. Instead, he pushed forward a stack of carefully prepared legal documents. With a few decisive strokes of his pen, then, the vast majority of the auction proceeds were instantly locked away. He established a massive, permanent engineering scholarship in the name of the brilliant doomed man who had hidden his life's work inside a copper tube. Then he signed the paperwork for an impenetrable trust fund for Leo, a financial fortress that would guarantee the boy's education, health, and freedom for the rest of his life. Caleb kept only enough to upgrade the tools in his mountain garage. There would be no luxury cars, no mansions, no tailored suits. He had survived the horrors of war. He knew exactly how fragile and meaningless sudden wealth could be if it wasn't anchored to something real. Horrors, later, the oppressive heat of the city had been left far behind. The dawn was breaking over the Appalachian Mountains, painting the dense pine forests in bruised shades of purple and gold. The air pouring through the cracked window of the old, rattling pickup truck was freezing, clean, completely silent. Leo was fast asleep in the passenger seat, his head resting against a bundled jacket, his toy truck sitting safely on the dashboard. Caleb pulled the truck into the dirt driveway of his modest home. He carried the sleeping boy inside, tucked him securely into his bed, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the steady, peaceful rise and fall of the child's chest. The burden of the future had been permanently lifted. Stepping back out into the morning chill, Caleb walked across the gravel to his dusty, grease-stained garage. He flipped on the overhead lights, walked over to his worn workbench, and picked up a heavy, familiar steel wrench. The cold metal felt perfect against his calloused palm. Down in the valleys, the elite world was still tearing itself apart over money, power, prestige, forever trapped in their own noise. But up here, surrounded by the towering pines, the old pickup truck faded quietly into the thick, rolling mountain mist, leaving the glittering arrogance of Atlanta behind forever.